Jim Swilley. This is A Tale of Two Cities, Part 2. Last episode, we talked about the opening lines of the Dickens classic, A Tale of Two Cities, where he said, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. We talked about Peter on the day of Pentecost preaching and rebuking the people for crucifying Jesus, but in the same breath saying it was exactly as the Father planned. And the rhetorical question is the worst thing that ever happened to you the best thing that ever happened? Or does it just hurt like hell and you can't see anything good out of it at all? I mean, be honest about it. Tell me about yours, Brian.
Well, I mean, we were experiencing, I were experiencing church drama at the same time. Slightly different yours because of who you are. Mine was because of bad decisions. But being a pastor, having an affair with one of the members, with a kid involved and all of that stuff, obviously a bad decision. But what happened with me was I experienced what church people really think about people when we catch them with their hands in the cookie jar, in spite of all of the love and the forgiveness and all that stuff that we preach, and the lesson that I learned is church people love to shout about David, but they don't want to meet the real David.
Yeah.
They don't, and it in spite of the fact that I made bad choices, it killed me to see that I worshiped God with people who really didn't believe him to be God or really didn't have that kind of love. And it changed me to the degree where I try, I don't succeed all the time, but I try to stand by people regardless of things. Now, obviously we have to make, better choices and all of that. But sometimes we make bad ones. And even when we make bad ones, we still need somebody to say, hey, you made a dumb choice, but I'm with you, And
do you think it would have been different if there hadn't been a pregnancy involved and a baby born? Do you think people would have responded to it differently? Because, and I'm not saying anything that you haven't said in your book, but you love your little girl and you're a good father to her, and your wife has made room for that in your life together. And you don't hide the fact that you have, you don't consider her an outside child. That's your
she's mine. That's
your blessing. It looks just like you nearly. I remember when I first met Brian, he told me about it. Was that before or after she was born? I don't remember.
Just before she was born.
And I said, it doesn't make any difference with me. I mean, it's going to affect the way people. There's a reason why Jesus told the woman caught in adultery, go and sin no more. He's saying, I don't condemn you. Your condemners have left, but if you do this again, these same people are going to drag you out here and try to stone you. And any of us who have nearly been stoned would say, tell me something I don't know. And I remember before I came out publicly, Brian called me and he said, I want to have you preach in my church this coming August. And I said, well, there's some things that are probably going to happen in the next few months that may make you think differently about that. And he said, look, I told you all my stuff and it didn't change anything about the way you felt about me. It doesn't change anything about the way I feel about you. And he is, I've noticed you've kept, even on YouTube, the video, before I ever met you, of me prophesying over you at the old building. And I've read all the comments under there. I mean, all the usual horrible stuff that, I don't know, Robert, have you ever heard in Romans 1 that Paul said something? In 42 years of preaching, I had never heard that.
Oh, my goodness.
But there was all that, and part of me wanted to say, Brian, just take it off YouTube. You're just asking for trouble. But he has stood by me and said, no, this is my truth. I'll tell you one thing: the truth doesn't make your life easy, but the truth does make you free. Yes. And you have to choose which reality do you want to live in. You can live in a lie and make your life easier, or you can live in truth and really be free. I personally opt for freedom.
The biggest proponent for inclusion is exclusion. What I mean by that is when you find out that you're actually excluded according to the law, it's a little easier for you to include other people. And so it's easy for us to point fingers and say, oh, well, I'm not at this moment, I'm not caught in the cookie jar. So I can point my finger, but eventually we all have different things that and morality, of course, is relevant to different societies and different people. But my point is, we all do things that others wouldn't, smile upon, and that's why we need to put our hands down and stop pointing fingers at people. Because when you realize, if you're going to live by the letter, that we're all screwed without the grace of God, it makes you say, you know what, I'm just going to be quiet and be glad that I'm at the table and that God invited me to.
I will say this. You said you found out, good point, Judah. You found out, sadly, what people in the church can be like. The upside to that is the people who are in my life now, including those of you sitting at this table, you know everything about me. And it doesn't change anything about our connection. My friendship has cost David a lot, and David has sent my book to many of his contemporaries, and some of you, if these were names, if I told you, most of you would know them. I mean, he's been very connected, very successful ministry, and he sent my book to every one of his contemporaries, which I told him, you're just asking for trouble. I'm not asking you to do that. These guys are going to cut you off if they read this. And some of them have. And he actually said, this is kind of a different topic, but he actually told his friends, he said, if you can't be a friend of Jim Swilley's, you can't be a friend of mine. Wow. I said, well, now that's real intercession. You're basically giving them an ultimatum. And some of them said, well, then we're not friends. Wow. And that's, I mean, how many people in your life do you meet that do that? But if something is real, and we felt like there was a God connection, and part of the reason I named my book First the Good News is that's what he kept saying to me. You're not a pastor, you're a voice. You're supposed to be out there, telling the good news to people, and that's why I need to get you caught up on some of by the time this airs, it will already be a reality, but that's huge, and this isn't the topic isn't about covenant relationships right now. That's sort of a different thing, but the good part of the Tale of Two Cities, best of times, worst of times, the best of times is finding out that there, believe it or not, are actually some people who love you unconditionally and don't judge you, and that's awesome. That's awesome.
If it weren't for a piece of your worst time, the building and your life dream, because I would drive by that almost every day, and I couldn't connect with that.
You preached against me. You were that big mega church preacher
back
in the day.
It was impossible, and if the circumstances hadn't come where you did come out and you lost that, I never would have met you. Right. And meeting you has been one of the greatest blessings in my life, and it gave me a seat at the table. And so for me, it's wow. I am so. It didn't cost me anything. I mean, it's that Robin worm story. I mean, in that situation, but I think we all have that worm story in our lives. I know, because it eats you up. Your own display out there for all the vulnerability, with all the vulnerability of all the things that have gone wrong or have come against you or for you. Mine was the simplicity of the Lord saying, "I will not be mocked. You're going to the sea," and getting to meet Nebuchadnezzar. Which I never wanted to meet, but it's that same thing that it takes place in one's life to get a seat at the table if one wants to go to a different place or meet a God that's far bigger than what you've ever experienced before.
Wow. Rebecca, what do you think?
There were a lot of times I could chalk up to my worst, but I think they have all worked for my good. It always takes manure to make pretty flowers. I remember going to a little bitty church where everybody was so full of God and so full of the Spirit, yet they couldn't discern that 16 children among myself were being touched by a man whose desires were not godly. That jacked me up. That pissed me off. That made me not like church. And then being different in West Georgia, where everybody either wore camouflage or wore preppy clothes, and if you decide, God forbid, you wear all black, suddenly your parents are like, "Oh, you're into witchcraft."
Right.
So there was that, and then being a little bit of a smart aleck, pumping up against my dad some, and my father walking in a religious spirit at the time, assuming that I was into witchcraft and that I was a lesbian, two of which were the worst things in all of West Georgia. And then him telling that to the church. So,
Thanks.
Appreciate you, Dad. My response.
He doesn't think that now.
He doesn't. Yeah, he
On the
definitely
other
doesn't.
side.
He's amazing. But my response at the time was kind of like, you know what? Church is stupid and Christians suck. I kind of like Jesus, but I will never go back to church ever again.
Mm-hmm.
And, I had an encounter with Christ after some pharmaceuticals. And I went back to church. And I remember walking in with green hair and stretched ears and tattoos and bondage gear and pink pants and walking in and being like, hey, what's up? I'm here to learn about Jesus. And, and just seeing the faces of people at the table. And then falling back in love again with the church and realizing I am the church, even though I was so mad at her. And yes, the church is a whore, but she's my mother. Like, I'm just as unfaithful.
Well, there's that.
Yeah, there's that whole thing. So, I don't know, but without those experiences, I would not be able to identify with people who've been so hurt by some institutions, whether it's the church or whether it's by academia or whether it's this other institution or the corporate world who just say, you know what, I don't fit in their box. And I don't think there is a box. And I don't know. I think the table is so big that everybody's welcome. I don't think there's any circles to be drawn.
I think even just the way that Jesus chose his staff, if you look at that, you think that's not even good business sense. He doesn't have one rabbinical student. They're all, one of them, Simon the Zealot, was like a terrorist who, the Canaanites were.
Praise the Lord, passe ammunition.
Yeah, and connected with Jesus because he thought Jesus could overthrow the Roman government. And Matthew is a tax collector who's, really a puppet of the Roman government, who's just hated by these people. And Jesus completely chooses them. And in doing so, it lets you know, well, he doesn't go by Moses' standard at all. Of course, according to Moses, everybody you've ever met's going to be.
And he chose Judas.
Yes, and knew ahead of time what Judas was capable of. And actually, when the scripture says Satan entered Judas, Jesus said, whatever you're going to do it quickly. He didn't try to rebuke that out of him. He said, you're fulfilling a certain part in my life. That's the part of us that we don't want to see. The God who tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, let the people go, but is simultaneously hardening Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah, right.
That's like, what? Are you just playing with me? Why are you doing this? Wouldn't it make it easier if you softened Pharaoh's heart? And I don't want to believe that we're just these pawns on the big chessboard. I just watched, did you ever see The Truman Show with Jim Carrey? It was on one of those networks the other night, and I was watching it. And it's a real metaphor for the idea that God is this puppet master who's, just messing with your life. I don't want to think that. I want to think that there's a greater purpose in it. And I don't think necessarily everything is God ordained. I think some things we bring on ourselves. God didn't actually originate them, but they do work together for our good. And there's a whole purpose in, Jacob wrestling with the angel or wrestling with the Lord, saying, I'm not going to let go of this difficult circumstance until it blesses me. Can you hold on to something until it really is a blessing, even if it wounds you? Because Jacob walks away from the wrestling match limping. He didn't just skip away from it. It just, when you go through stuff, life is good, but you're a little more sober. You're a little more even-tempered. You're a little more, like even you were saying about being grateful. You appreciate things that you might have taken for granted.
Or felt entitled to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And well, cool. Well, when you talk about God, the scripture tells us that he's acquainted with our grief and our sorrow. And for years in churches, I would hear people say, well, God won't put no more on you than you can bear. And one time I just told the lady, I'm like, where are you getting that from?
Well, it's a misquote. Was it 1 Corinthians 10:13?
He won't allow you to be
but the implication is like, like I think you can handle one. It's like God will train. It's like God's this trainer and he's adding a little more weight with each.
But God don't life is hell sometimes. We have to just admit that. We bury our children, we bury our
Right.
spouses, we face cancer, we face HIV, we
Right.
face crack addictions, we face alcoholism. God don't just sit up there and say, well, at least
One more trial.
that one,
Right.
alcoholism. Go
It's
get
like
him.
Yeah.
the
You
end
know?
of I'll let you go next, Robert.
Yeah.
The end of Tombstone, when it's the only Western I like, and it's when Doc Holliday is dying and Wyatt Earp goes to see him, and he goes, he says, "There's not good or bad stuff, Wyatt. There's just life. It's just life, and it happens." And I thought, well, there's a certain amount of truth to that. It does rain on the just and the unjust.
Yes.
What are you going to say?
What Samson loved more than anything else is pretty women. He had kind of a thing for women, and that's what he liked. We all have different, I guess, ministries or callings, and what I always liked is children. I love children so much. When I got my license as a teenager, I drove to Cobb General Hospital to sit in the waiting room with strangers as they had babies. I don't know why. I just always loved the whole idea. Ended up marrying and having 10 natural kids, and had so much pride in my family and my kids and that's when Samson had his eyes put out, he could no longer see the one thing he wanted to see more than anything, and that's the one thing I lost was my connection with my kids and my pride in being the greatest father in the world. It's the one thing I no longer had. And in the middle of that in-between part we're talking about, that grace period where we need that in-between stretch, I got such a revelation from the scriptures, 5 simple words that really changed my perspective in my life, and maybe somebody needs to hear it. But as Samson was there, in his worst moment, he was now blind, he was now captured by the Philistines, and the scripture says simply, his hair began to grow. There's something inside that nothing can hold back. And as that hair began to grow again, I'm the first single white male gay man allowed by the courts to adopt a non-relative baby girl in the state of Georgia, according to what our lawyer said.
Wow.
And I get to do this again, the thing that I love the most. But in the middle of my tribulation, my Armageddon, in the middle of all that going on, the hair was still there.
Yes.
And it began to grow. And given the right and the proper timing, it'll come back. And the very worst thing that ever happened to me is now the very best thing that ever happened to me.
Right.
And your hair looks good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Which brings me, we just have a couple more minutes, but, it brings me to something I feel very strongly about. It's living with no regret. And living with no regret doesn't mean you don't live with some scars. You live with some pain. I mean, that's unrealistic to say that you could remember some things and you remember, like one night, and we're not going to get into it right now, but David has a retreat center up in North Carolina, and his adult daughter passed away a few years ago, and we had never really discussed it. And it was one night after all of the meetings were over, and I said, "Just tell me, explain to me, walk me through what happened with your daughter." And he, for the first time, opened up and told me that. Well, by the time he's through, I'm sobbing because I have an adult daughter. I can't even get my head around what that would be like. And I asked him the hard questions. I mean, I asked him stuff that I couldn't have asked him if I didn't know him better. But like, what did that feel like? What did you do? Did you not have your phone on? What happened? Who told you? Because I'm so amazed. Like, dear God, how did you get on the other side of that? And he is on the other side of it, but I'm sure it still hurts like hell. There's no way that it couldn't. And what you have to do is say, well, then I'm not gonna look at anything regretfully. I'm gonna say whatever has happened has happened. I'm not gonna change it, even if I could. And even Jesus, in a glorified body, still had the scars from his crucifixion. So I'm going to incorporate my scars are going to be a part of my reality, part of my story, and I will not feel sorry for myself because he has gone on to have a beautiful life, and as we all have, we have come through the fire. Right. I see when you post pictures of your little girl, and I don't see anything of you and her together. I don't see anything about that smacks of a curse. Everything looks like a blessing, and you're so happy. Completely. And so you think, wow, you do get to the other side of things. Yeah. And that to me is when your ministry becomes effective. you really are a wounded healer. Not, like, you could say something to that woman who lost her house that you couldn't have said if you hadn't lost your house.
No.
Which is why we need
Right. I have
everybody.
a lot of empathy
you know,
with that.
somebody that has never lost something cannot. They don't know what they're talking
Right.
about
Yeah.
when they say, "Oh, it's not that big a deal." No, it is. It's a very big deal, and it turned my life upside down. But I got to the other side.
That's why
of
I
it.
choose to believe that, going back to Romans 8:28, that all things work together. I've even gotten away from saying that everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe
because it's
that.
like, well, someone got raped. I'm not gonna say
What
that
was the
happened for a
reason for that?
But what you can say is God can take those things, and you can take those things. It doesn't even have to just be in God's hand. And you can make them work for your life, make them work for your story, and ultimately the world.
I'm not through talking about this. We'll put a comma right here, and we'll come back and discuss it a little bit more. Thanks for joining us on In the Now with Jim Swilley.